On the morning of May 29th, 1453, a 15-year-old Byzantine princess stood behind a cracked marble window, watching her world collapse. Outside, the Ottoman cannons thundered, shaking the last walls of Constantinople, a city that had stood for more than 1,000 years. Smoke drifted over the domes, bells screamed across the skyline, and among the chaos, a name was whispered in every corridor of the imperial palace: Mehmed. He was only 21, a conqueror born from prophecy, carrying the weight of centuries on his shoulders. In mere hours, Sultan Mehmed II would stride into the ancient throne room where emperors once ruled, and before him would stand a terrified girl, Princess Theodora, the last spark of a dying empire. What happened between them in those next 72 hours would become one of the most controversial, hidden, and misunderstood moments in world history. A moment that blurred the line between mercy and manipulation, between conquest and compassion. This is not a tale of simple victory. It is the story of a ruler who wanted to be remembered as Caesar and a girl who survived an empire's end by becoming part of its rebirth. The spring of 1453 was the season when the Byzantine Empire breathed its last, and the heartbeat of Constantinople echoed like a funeral drum across the Golden Horn. Inside its ancient walls stood a city that had defied time and invaders for more than a millennium, a city that believed it could never fall because God himself had chosen it as his fortress on earth. But as the sun rose over the Marmara Sea that May, the sky was blackened with the smoke of Ottoman cannons, and the earth shook beneath their fire. To those who watched from the palace balconies, it seemed as if the end of the world had come with iron and thunder. Within the marble corridors of the imperial palace, a young girl named Princess Theodora Palaiologina moved through the shadows of fear. At 15, she was the last flower of a dynasty that had once ruled the Mediterranean. Her father had died years earlier, her uncles were scattered in the Peloponnese, and her world had shrunk to the echoing halls of a dying court. Tutors had taught her the Greek classics, music, and languages so she could marry into some foreign nobility. Instead, she was now learning the sounds of war, the crash of stone walls splitting under the blast of cannonballs, and the distant chants of soldiers calling on a different god. Beyond the ramparts, the Ottoman army stood like a living sea. 80,000 men, 200 ships, and the great bombards of a Hungarian engineer named Orban surrounded the city that had once called itself the New Rome. Among those guns was one so enormous that its thunder could be heard 10 miles away, and its shot, a stone ball weighing more than 1,000 pounds, could pulverize any fortress wall on earth. For 57 days, this siege had turned Constantinople into a cauldron of smoke and desperation. Inside the walls were no more than 7,000 defenders, Greeks, Venetians, and Genoese, facing odds so impossible that each day they wondered not whether they would die, but when. Every night, priests walked the streets with icons and candles, their voices pleading with heaven to spare the city that had once been the heart of Christendom. Children slept under altars, women wept over barricades made of furniture and stone, and the air smelled of gunpowder, burning pitch, and hopeless faith. The old law of war was known to all. If a city fell by force, its conquerors were entitled to 3 days of plunder. Everyone understood what that meant. To the citizens, defeat was not only death, it was enslavement, humiliation, and the end of their names forever. In the palace above the Golden Horn, Emperor Constantine V Palaiologos, a man without an heir, without escape, and without illusions, prepared to meet his fate. He knew he would not survive the coming day. Yet his concern was for those who would be left behind, especially the younger branches of his family, and among them, Theodora. That night, her mother, a woman history calls only Lady Euphrosyne, made a terrible decision of love and necessity. She cut her daughter's hair short, rubbed soot on her hands to roughen them, and dressed her in the coarse wool of a servant. If the palace was taken, she prayed that a kitchen maid might be overlooked where a princess would be claimed. As the night deepened, church bells mingled with the drums of the besieging army. From the walls came the shouts of soldiers manning their last defenses. The sky was lit with the red glow of burning barricades. And in the Ottoman camp, beneath a tent adorned with Quranic verses, a young ruler knelt in prayer. He was the same age as the princess he would soon meet, yet the weight he carried was that of Alexander and Caesar combined. Sultan Mehmed II, called by his men Fatih, the Conqueror, had vowed that he would either take Constantinople or be buried beneath its walls. Before the final assault, he offered terms to the emperor: surrender peacefully, and the people would be spared; resist, and the city would be claimed by fire and sword. The Byzantine answer was simple and defiant: better to die as free men than to live as slaves. Thus, the fate of a 1,000-year-old empire was sealed. Inside the palace, Theodora clutched a small silver cross as the ground trembled beneath her feet. She did not yet know that by the next morning the walls would be breached, her home would burn, and she would stand before the man history would call both a destroyer and a visionary. Long before the walls of Constantinople began to crack, the destiny of the city had already taken shape in the mind of one man. Sultan Mehmed II, barely in his 20s, had grown up surrounded by the legends of Alexander, the victories of his father Murad II, and the ghostly promise that the empire of the Prophet would one day claim the empire of Rome. He was not yet the conqueror. The world would one day name him, but he was already consumed by an idea that eclipsed youth, sleep, and fear. To him, Constantinople was not merely a capital to be taken, it was a prophecy to be fulfilled, a crown to be seized from time itself. From childhood he had been marked by contradiction. At 12 he had worn the crown for the first time, only to be forced to abdicate when rebellion rose and his father reclaimed the throne. At 19 he ascended again, hardened by humiliation, determined to prove that the boy who had once been dismissed as a figurehead would now become the most formidable ruler of his age. He spoke 6 languages: Turkish, Arabic, Persian, Greek, Latin, and Hebrew, and read voraciously. He studied mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy, yet it was history that ruled his heart. He kept under his pillow a copy of Arrian's account of Alexander the Great, tracing with his fingers the routes the Macedonian had marched. His courtiers whispered that the young sultan no longer merely wanted victory, he wanted immortality. When he looked toward Constantinople, he did not see a Christian city or an enemy fortress. He saw New Rome, the missing piece that would make his empire divine. Every sunrise reminded him that his forefathers had failed where he must not. The Byzantine walls were a challenge from fate, and every report from scouts about their strength only deepened his resolve. Even his own generals urged caution. They warned him that such a siege could break armies, bankrupt empires, and destroy reputations. But Mehmed had been shaped by rejection, mocked by European courts as a child, doubted by his janissaries as a youth. Failure, he believed, was already written in his blood. Conquest was the only way to rewrite it. So he prepared with a precision that terrified his enemies and astonished his allies. He summoned artisans from across his dominions, engineers from Hungary, sailors from Anatolia, scholars from Persia, and gunners from the Balkans. Under his command rose a force the world had never seen: 80,000 soldiers, disciplined and obedient, a navy of 200 ships ready to seal the city by sea, and a line of siege guns so immense that they changed the sound of war itself. Each day his camp echoed with the rhythmic pounding of blacksmiths forging shot for the great cannon, an iron beast 27 feet long, capable of hurling stones heavier than a horse. Yet beneath this calculated ferocity lay a restless mind. Mehmed's obsession was not born solely of ambition, but of identity. The Ottoman court at Edirne was a mirror of empires past, its ceremonies half Islamic, half Byzantine, its scholars quoting both the Quran and Aristotle. To rule such a realm, Mehmed believed, required more than conquest. It required legitimacy. He dreamed of uniting East and West beneath one diadem, of becoming not only Sultan of Islam but Caesar of Rome. His advisors could not fully grasp this vision. They saw a campaign, he saw a coronation ordained by destiny. On the eve of war he walked alone among the tents, listening to the murmur of the river and the distant chanting of the muezzins. Somewhere in the darkness he imagined hearing the tolling of the churches beyond the walls, the echo of hymns rising from the Hagia Sophia. The thought did not fill him with hatred, but with strange awe. That city, with its domes of gold and mosaics of light, was the last heir of the world that had given birth to philosophy, science, and art. To possess it was to inherit the wisdom of antiquity itself. To destroy it would be to burn his own future. Thus the young sultan's heart was divided, half fire, half intellect, half conqueror, half philosopher. His diary, written in elegant Arabic script, carried verses about the frailty of glory and the eternity of knowledge. But when he raised his eyes from the page, he saw only those unbroken walls on the horizon. He could not allow mercy to outweigh destiny. As his army assembled, banners rippling like crimson seas, the drums of war began to echo across the plains of Thrace. Mehmed mounted his white stallion, lifted his sword toward the sky, and swore before God that he would either take the city or die at its gates. His generals knelt, his soldiers roared their allegiance, and in that thunderous moment the fate of Constantinople and of Princess Theodora, still hidden within its doomed palaces, was sealed. When dawn broke over the Bosporus on April 6, 1453, the siege began, not as a single battle, but as a slow suffocation. Constantinople's mighty Theodosian walls, once thought impenetrable, rose like a defiant relic of a vanished age. Behind them stood only 7,000 defenders, Greeks, Venetians, and a scattering of Spaniards, facing an Ottoman force that outnumbered them more than 10 to 1. From the hills above Galata to the shores of the Propontis, the Ottoman banners stretched in an unbroken ring of red and gold, each bearing the crescent that promised divine victory. The city that had resisted Persians, Arabs, Crusaders, and Bulgars now faced the full force of a modern empire forged by science, faith, and vengeance. Each day the cannons roared until the air itself seemed to bleed. The Great Bombard, Orban's monstrous creation, built under Mehmed's patronage, shook the earth whenever it fired, its thunder rolling like the voice of God across the straits. Stones weighing half a ton crashed into the outer wall, sending clouds of marble dust over the defenders. The ground trembled, bells fell from towers, and priests clutched their icons tighter. Within the city, panic gave way to grim resignation. Food dwindled, wells ran dry, and corpses piled up faster than they could be buried. Yet the people prayed still, believing that an angel would descend to save them at the final hour, as prophecy had promised. On the Ottoman side, Mehmed II observed the unfolding siege with the calculating calm of a man who believed he was enacting destiny. Each failure became a lesson, each setback a refinement of his design. He moved through his camps like a scholar through a library, studying terrain, measuring angles, consulting with gunners and engineers. His tent glowed at night with the light of oil lamps as he pored over maps, marking weak points, planning new assaults. He was relentless yet patient, as if time itself belonged to him. His generals urged a pause to conserve supplies, but Mehmed refused. "An empire does not wait," he said, "for eternity to begin." For weeks, the rhythm of destruction continued, cannon fire by day, repairs by night. Inside the city, the defenders patched cracks with stone, timber, even sarcophagi stolen from cemeteries. Every citizen became a soldier. Women carried water to the ramparts, children molded clay for fortifications, monks tended to the wounded. The emperor himself, Constantine VII, fought side by side with his men, his armor blackened by soot, his face hardened by fatigue. And somewhere deep within the palace, Princess Theodora listened to the distant thunder, each blast a reminder that her world was shrinking by the hour. She imagined the conqueror on the other side, a man of her own age, unseen yet omnipresent, and wondered what kind of heart could command such ruin with divine conviction. Then came the sea attack. Mehmed's fleet, unable to breach the great chain across the Golden Horn, did what no strategist had dared to imagine. On the night of April 22nd, under torchlight and rain, he ordered his ships dragged across land on greased timbers, bypassing the barrier entirely. By morning, the citizens of Constantinople woke to an impossible sight: Ottoman war galleys floating within the Horn itself, their red sails reflected in the still waters like an omen. It was a miracle of engineering and madness combined, a gesture of genius that shattered the defenders' hope. From that moment on, the city knew it was living on borrowed time. By late May, famine and exhaustion gnawed at both sides. Disease spread through the Ottoman camps, and yet the young sultan pressed forward. He offered terms of surrender again: clemency, safe passage, respect for their faith, but Emperor Constantine refused once more. His reply was recorded by witnesses: "To surrender the city is beyond the right of any living soul, for all of us have chosen to die with it. That night, church bells echoed over the trembling city for the final time. Orthodox and Catholic, divided for centuries, now prayed side by side in the Hagia Sophia, voices blending in desperate harmony. Candles flickered beneath golden mosaics as tears mixed with incense and smoke. In his camp, Mehmed II rode alone along the lines of his soldiers, silent but resolute. He gazed toward the walls glowing faintly under moonlight and felt no joy, only inevitability. The siege had ceased to be a contest of arms. It had become a ritual, an offering to the gods of history. He had staked everything, his throne, his youth, his soul, on this conquest. By the next sunrise, he would either be immortal or forgotten. As midnight passed into morning, the drums began. The air trembled under the collective roar of 80,000 men. From within the city came the answering clang of church bells, the metallic cry of a civilization preparing for its own funeral. When the cannons fell silent at last, there was only the sound of footsteps, the storming waves of soldiers advancing through smoke and ruin toward the walls that would finally break. And within those crumbling defenses, hidden behind a barricade of overturned furniture, Princess Theodora whispered her last prayer as the empire of her ancestors burned outside her window. When the sun rose on May 29th, 1453, Constantinople was no longer the queen of cities, but a grave of empires. The final assault had lasted barely a few hours, yet it felt to the survivors as though centuries had collapsed in a single morning. At dawn, the Ottoman drums began their thunder, followed by the chants of Allahu Akbar rolling like an endless tide. 3 waves of soldiers hurled themselves against the battered walls. The first were irregulars, the desperate and the poor, who died in droves under Greek fire and falling stones. The second wave pressed harder, pushing ladders through smoke and rubble. Then, at the hour when the mists began to lift, the Janissaries advanced. Mehmed's personal guard, disciplined and terrifying, carrying their curved scimitars as if the battle were a sacred rite. Inside the walls, chaos devoured order. The Genoese commander Giovanni Giustiniani, mortally wounded by an arrow, was carried from his post, and with his retreat, the city's defense disintegrated. A forgotten postern gate called Kirkoporta, left open during a sortie, became the wound through which the empire bled. The Ottomans poured in, their banners rising where once the double-headed eagle had flown. Emperor Constantine VII, seeing that the end had come, tore off his imperial cloak, drew his sword, and plunged into the melee shouting, "The city has fallen, and I am still alive." His body was never found, but his legend became eternal. The conquerors surged through the streets, claiming what war and faith had promised them. For the people of Constantinople, it was an apocalypse. Flames licked the marble facades, smoke blotted out the sky, and the air filled with the wails of those dragged from hiding. Churches were broken open, treasures looted, and the bells of the Hagia Sophia fell silent beneath the trampling of boots. Men were cut down where they stood, while women and children were herded into the hippodrome, to be counted and divided as spoils of war. Between 30 and 50,000 were enslaved that day. The city that had once rivaled Rome, reduced to a market of human lives. In the palace overlooking the Golden Horn, Princess Theodora, disguised as a servant, clung to the shadows as soldiers stormed through the corridors. The marble halls where emperors had walked now echoed with the clatter of armor and the breaking of icons. She hid behind amphorae of oil and shattered furniture, her heart hammering so violently that she feared the sound would betray her. Outside, the cries of captives merged with the low roar of distant fires. Hours passed like centuries. When silence finally settled, it was not peace but exhaustion, the strange stillness that comes only after destruction has done its work. Then came the moment that changed history. Near midday, Sultan Mehmed II entered his conquered city. Riding a white stallion through the Adrianople gate, he advanced slowly, not as a looter, but as a monarch. His procession moved through ruins and corpses, past burning houses and collapsed domes, yet his gaze remained fixed on one destination, the Hagia Sophia. When he reached its shattered bronze doors, he dismounted, scooped a handful of soil from the ground, and poured it over his turban, a sign of humility before God. Inside the vast church, the mosaics of Christ glittered faintly through smoke. Mehmed walked to the altar, pressed his hand against the marble, and declared, "There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his messenger." With that, the greatest cathedral of Christendom became Hagia Sophia Kami, the Mosque of the Conqueror. But even in victory, Mehmed defied expectation. Islamic law allowed his men 3 days of pillage, yet after a single day he ordered it stopped. He commanded that no more blood be spilled, that citizens hiding in their homes should be spared, that the city's surviving inhabitants would be allowed to return. His generals were astonished. They had seen conquerors before, but never one who understood that terror could win battles, while mercy could build empires. Mehmed did not wish to be remembered as a destroyer of worlds. He wanted to stand where Caesar had stood, to be crowned not only by the sword but by civilization itself. Among the prisoners catalogued by the Grand Vizier that evening was a young girl discovered in the ruins of the palace. Her clothing was that of a servant, but her speech and bearing betrayed noble blood. She was brought before the Sultan, trembling and silent, her face smudged with soot, her hands raw from hiding. The marble floor beneath her feet was still stained with blood. Mehmed studied her carefully, not as a captive, but as an enigma. The records describe that she spoke softly, identifying herself as Theodora Palaiologina, niece of the fallen emperor. Tradition dictated she would be enslaved or taken into the harem. Instead, the Sultan paused, and in that pause, the course of history shifted. The courtiers expected a command of possession, yet what emerged from his lips was a decree of protection. Mehmed ordered that Princess Theodora be released, given shelter, and placed under imperial guardianship. She was to receive a stipend, a residence, and the right to continue her faith unmolested. To the astonishment of all present, he spared her life entirely. No one understood why. Some saw strategy, others compassion, and a few whispered that the young sultan saw in her reflection something of his own youth, 2 children of empires that had demanded too much from them. The scene that unfolded in the throne room of the conquered palace would echo through the chronicles of both East and West for centuries to come. The marble floor was darkened with ash and blood, the air still heavy with the scent of smoke and crushed incense. Amid the ruin, Sultan Mehmed II sat upon a makeshift throne of gilded wood taken from the remnants of the Byzantine court, his expression unreadable. Before him stood Princess Theodora, barely more than a child, yet carrying on her small shoulders the shattered pride of 1,000 years of empire. The silence between them was not merely the pause of interrogation, it was the meeting of 2 worlds, the fallen and the ascendant, the last breath of Rome and the first of a new civilization. Witnesses described how Theodora trembled, yet when Mehmed asked her name, she lifted her eyes and spoke it clearly. She admitted her lineage and the death of her uncle, the emperor. Her courage, fragile but defiant, caught the Sultan's attention. The courtiers awaited his verdict, knowing what Ottoman custom demanded. Noble captives were to be claimed as property of the conqueror, trophies of triumph, reminders to all of the fate that awaited resistance. But Mehmed's mind moved differently. He saw in this young woman not a prize of war, but a symbol of something greater: continuity, legitimacy, the bridge that could join his dream of empire to the heritage of Rome itself. He questioned her education, her faith, and her knowledge of languages. When she replied that she could read Greek, Latin, and some Arabic, he smiled faintly, perhaps seeing in her the embodiment of the world he wished to rule, the Christian past fluent in the language of the Islamic present. Then, with a single command that stunned the room, Mehmed ordered that Theodora be released, not enslaved, not harmed, but placed under imperial protection with a pension from the state treasury. She was to live freely, to worship as she pleased, and to represent the mercy of the Sultan's reign. In that moment, history turned. The conqueror who had shattered the Byzantine Empire had also given it a strange, surviving pulse within his own dominion. To his generals, this was madness. To Mehmed, it was politics of the highest order. He saw that the throne he now occupied could not simply replace the vanished Caesars, it must inherit them. If he wished to be called Kaiser-i Rum, the Caesar of Rome, he had to act not as a destroyer, but as a successor. And to rule the Christian subjects of his new realm, he needed their loyalty, not their corpses. Thus began one of the most remarkable transformations in history. Within weeks, Mehmed reopened the city's markets, summoned Greek scholars to his court, and appointed Gennadios Scholarios, a Byzantine theologian, as the new Orthodox patriarch, granting him authority to govern the empire's Christian population. He restored sections of the city, repaired aqueducts, and invited artisans from across Europe to rebuild what had been burned. Where others saw a conquered ruin, Mehmed envisioned a reborn capital, Istanbul, the crossroads of worlds. His mercy toward Theodora became a symbol whispered across the devastated neighborhoods. The Sultan who had taken everything had also chosen to give back life. Theodora herself lived quietly under Ottoman guardianship. Records from palace archives describe her receiving regular stipends, a residence in the Fener district, and visits from scholars and clerics who saw in her survival proof of divine will. She witnessed the city's transformation. Churches converted into mosques, markets filling again, Greek scribes entering service under Ottoman officials. Some said Mehmed visited her once more, speaking to her of history and governance, seeking her understanding of Byzantine law. Whether this meeting truly occurred or became legend, its spirit endured, the conqueror and the captive bound not by passion but by the shared weight of legacy. Years later, when Theodora left Constantinople for the Peloponnese, she did so not as a slave but as a free noblewoman. She married quietly, lived modestly, and died in peace, her name fading from popular memory but preserved in Ottoman records and the marginal notes of Byzantine exiles. Her survival confounded both Christian and Muslim chroniclers. The West could not easily glorify a conqueror who had shown mercy. The East hesitated to celebrate compassion that contradicted the traditions of conquest, and so her story, like the city itself, became a paradox, a ruin that breathed, a defeat that concealed rebirth. Historians now see Mehmed's act not as an impulse of kindness, but as a declaration of empire. By sparing the last Byzantine princess, he symbolically absorbed her lineage into his own, proclaiming to the world that Rome had not died. It had changed hands. He built universities, libraries, and observatories, patronized scholars of both faiths, and collected manuscripts from the West to preserve within his domains. His empire, though born in blood, aspired to knowledge. The conqueror of Constantinople became its protector. The destroyer of walls became a builder of civilizations. And so, when we look back upon that day in the ruined throne room, we see more than the meeting of a sultan and a frightened girl. We see the point at which two eras touched, one collapsing into dust, the other rising from its ashes. Princess Theodora lived because the young sultan understood that a legacy preserved was more powerful than one annihilated. In his decision to spare her, Mehmed wrote his true conquest not upon the city's stones, but upon history itself. If this story of mercy amid conquest made you rethink what victory truly means, like the video, subscribe for more untold chapters of history, and let the world remember that even in its darkest hours, humanity sometimes finds its light in the unlikeliest of hearts.